Paul Ward could feel the weight of the paper in his hands, but the words on it blurred together like the rest of his life since Martha had passed. It was as though his entire existence had been suspended in time since that day. His eyes tried to focus on the document, the inheritance of a cave from a great uncle he'd never known. The lawyer, Fletcher Knox, had arrived that afternoon with news that made no sense at all. "A cave," Paul repeated, his voice raspy from disuse. "I don't understand. What am I supposed to do with a cave?" Fletcher shifted in his seat, obviously uncomfortable. "Your uncle's will was very clear, Paul. He left you the cave and nothing else, no money, no property. Just coordinates to a location south of here near Devil's Canyon." Paul blinked at the legal papers, trying to make sense of the jumble of words. His uncle, Ezra Ward, had passed away under suspicious circumstances 3 days ago. There had been little to say about the man, save for a few whispers around town. Paul had never met him, never even heard his name mentioned, until now. "Is it just rock?" Paul asked, the words heavy with doubt. Fletcher hesitated before answering. "Local authorities say it's nothing more than rock and darkness, Paul. They investigated Ezra's death in the Canyonlands, but they found no signs of value, nothing but an abandoned cave. It's likely just as your uncle left it, isolated and forgotten." As Fletcher spoke, Rusty, Paul's red-coated shepherd, stood from where he'd been lying by the fireplace. The dog sniffed the papers with unusual intensity, his nose twitching with curiosity. The dog had been restless lately, pacing, barking at nothing and refusing food. Something was troubling him. Something was pulling at him that Paul couldn't quite understand. "There's one more thing," Fletcher continued, a small yellowed envelope now in his hands. "Your uncle left this note for you, and it's meant to be given only after you receive the inheritance." He slid the envelope across the table, and Paul took it with trembling hands. The note inside was brief, one sentence written in shaky handwriting. "Trust Martha's letters. She knew the truth about everything." The words hit Paul like a physical blow, tightening his chest in a way he hadn't felt since Martha's death. Martha's letters? What could they possibly mean? She never mentioned anything about Uncle Ezra and certainly never spoke of family beyond the few people she had known. This was something entirely new. Paul's eyes lifted from the letter, and he saw Rusty at the door, scratching at it with an urgency he had never seen before. The dog seemed agitated, more than usual. Every muscle in his body was coiled, his golden eyes wide, as if urging Paul to move, to do something. "Where exactly are these coordinates?" Paul asked, though he wasn't sure he really wanted to know. Fletcher glanced at the papers, clearly uneasy. "A day's ride south of here, near Devil's Canyon," Fletcher replied. "But Paul, I must warn you. There's been talk. Your neighbor, Darius Gentry, visited my office twice asking questions about any inheritance you might receive. He seemed far too interested in your uncle's affairs, and considering the circumstances of your uncle's death, I'd be cautious. Some men with secrets don't always meet peaceful ends." Paul raised an eyebrow. "You think Ezra's death wasn't an accident?" Fletcher's voice dropped to a near whisper. "I think men with secrets often meet unfortunate ends in remote places like this." Rusty suddenly started scratching at the door again, his claws clicking against the wood. His behavior was growing more erratic, more focused on something Paul couldn't see. His heart rate quickened. What was it that Rusty knew that Paul didn't? Fletcher stood up to leave, but before he could exit, Paul caught a nervous glance at the window. "Fletcher, what aren't you telling me about Ezra's death?" Paul asked, his voice tight. Fletcher hesitated, then paused at the door. "Just be careful down there, Paul," Fletcher warned, his voice low and serious. "If you find anything unusual, anything out of place, you might want to contact the federal marshal's office before anyone locally. Your uncle may have been involved in things bigger than just a cave inheritance." The lawyer's words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Paul knew that whatever Uncle Ezra had left him, it was more than just a worthless piece of rock. 3 days later, Paul found himself riding south toward Devil's Canyon, his saddlebags packed with supplies for a week. Darius Gentry's visit earlier that morning had weighed heavily on him. Darius had been far too eager to buy Paul out, offering him cash for something he'd never even seen. But it was the mention of Martha's letters that had driven Paul to make the journey. What could they mean? Where were they? Clutching the reins, Paul glanced at Rusty, who trotted beside him with an almost knowing determination. The dog had been acting strangely since Martha's death, but now, every few miles, he would stop and sniff the air like he was tracking something, then move forward with a renewed sense of urgency. What was it that Rusty knew? "Come on, boy," Paul murmured, urging the horse forward. "We'll find out soon enough." The canyon lands began to change as they rode deeper into the desert. The sky grew heavier, and the ground beneath them turned to rock and dust, as if nature itself was warning them. Paul had ridden these trails before, but it had been years since he'd ventured this far. Memories of Martha came flooding back. Her voice, her dreams of exploring these lands with him, of riding here to see the majestic rock formations she'd read about in her books. The memory was so vivid, it almost made him stop in his tracks. Martha had always been full of life, full of wonder for the world around her. The thought of her faded too soon, of her illness ravaging her body, brought a lump to his throat. 6 months had passed since the fever had claimed her life. But the grief still felt fresh, still felt like a shadow that followed him wherever he went. Then Rusty's excited barking interrupted his thoughts. The dog bolted ahead, and Paul kicked his horse into a gallop to follow. The trail they were on led up to a ridge, and when Paul reached the top, he saw the dog below him, sitting perfectly still in front of a narrow opening in the canyon wall. Rusty had found something. Paul dismounted and made his way down the steep slope, the rocks slipping beneath his boots. The cave entrance was wider than he'd expected, large enough for a man to walk through upright, but the interior quickly faded into darkness. Rusty sat at the entrance, his body still and rigid, his golden eyes locked on the cave as though he had been waiting for this moment. Paul felt his pulse quicken as he approached. This place, this cave, felt like it had a story to tell, one Paul hadn't yet heard. Paul stood still for a moment at the entrance of the cave, Rusty's golden eyes locked onto his. The dog was waiting for him, but not just to lead him in. It was as if the dog knew the significance of this place, knew that this cave wasn't just an inheritance but a key to answers Paul had never expected to find. Rusty's tail flicked slightly, breaking the tense silence. Paul took a deep breath, bracing himself for whatever lay beyond the narrow opening. The cave was darker than he had anticipated. Even with the lantern in his hand, the light barely seemed to cut through the thick darkness. He could feel the coolness of the rock against his skin as he moved forward, his boots crunching against the loose gravel that had accumulated inside. The passage was winding, narrow at times and expansive at others, twisting through the rock like the labyrinth of his own confusion. The further Paul went, the more it felt like the cave was swallowing him. Was this really just a random inheritance, a coincidence, or had Martha known all along that this place held secrets meant to be discovered? Rusty moved ahead, trotting lightly through the shadows, his nose close to the ground as though searching for something. Paul followed, his mind racing. He didn't know what he was expecting, but he wasn't prepared for the overwhelming feeling of destiny in this place. As if he was meant to be here, as if this was all part of something greater that was beyond his control. After what felt like hours, the passage opened into a large chamber. The cave walls expanded, and Paul could finally see more than just shadows. Rusty stopped at the far end of the chamber, his eyes focused on a stone slab in the center of the room. The ground here was smoother, as if someone had deliberately flattened the area. Paul moved closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the air grow heavier, thick with the weight of the past. The stone slab looked out of place, too perfectly shaped, its edges too smooth for it to be natural. He crouched down to examine it, running his fingers over the surface. It was cold to the touch, and as he pushed against it, he felt a slight give. His pulse quickened. This was it. This was the moment. Whatever secret Ezra had left behind, whatever Martha had known, was under this stone. With a grunt of effort, Paul pushed harder, and the stone slab shifted, revealing a small cavity beneath it. Rusty whined at his side, as if encouraging him to uncover whatever lay hidden. Paul reached into the cavity and pulled out a small metal box. It was old, its surface tarnished with age, but it seemed to pulse with significance. The box was locked, but Paul's heart sank when he noticed that the lock was no more than a flimsy barrier, easily broken. His hands were shaking as he twisted it open. Inside, he found something that made his blood run cold. A stack of letters, carefully tied with a faded ribbon. The top letter was addressed to Uncle Ezra. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Martha's. Paul's breath caught in his throat. What had Martha written to his uncle? Why had she hidden these letters away in such a secretive place? He opened the first letter, dated just a few years before her death. Dear Uncle Ezra, I know this letter will surprise you as I've never mentioned Paul's family before, but I need to make sure you understand what's happening. I've been diagnosed with something the doctor says is incurable, and I've been trying to find a way to ensure Paul's future. He doesn't know about the debts we're dealing with, and he certainly doesn't know the truth about your silver operation. Paul froze, his fingers trembling as he turned the page. His stomach twisted in knots. What was this? What did Martha know about Ezra's operation? About the silver? The letter continued. I've made arrangements with the marshals to expose the truth. Paul will never forgive me if he finds out the full extent of our family's involvement. But I'm doing this for him. For his future. I've told them everything about the silver and the risks he faces. You need to cooperate with them, Uncle. They'll protect him when I'm gone. Paul sat back, stunned, the weight of Martha's words sinking into him. She had been working with the federal authorities. She had known for months that she was dying, and she had made sure to secure Paul's safety even after her death. But why had she never told him? Why had she kept this secret from him? Rusty sat beside him, his eyes fixed on Paul, as though the dog understood the gravity of the situation. Paul could feel the dog's presence like a comforting weight, steadying him in the midst of the storm of confusion swirling around him. There were more letters. Paul opened another, dated just months before Martha's death. Uncle Ezra, I have spoken with the marshals and they are prepared to help us expose Darius Gentry and the entire silver operation. Paul has no idea, but he will understand one day. The cave will be our salvation. It holds the truth, and once it's exposed, Paul will have everything he needs to protect himself. Martha had known. She had known that Ezra's silver operation wasn't just about mining. It was about something much darker, something that involved Darius Gentry. She had worked behind the scenes to ensure that Paul was safe, to make sure that the dangerous men who had been manipulating their lives would be stopped. And now, as Paul read through each letter, he understood. Martha hadn't just been protecting him from Ezra's past. She had been protecting him from men like Darius, men who would use and abuse him if given the chance. But something else was lurking in the shadows, something Paul hadn't yet uncovered. Rusty stood up suddenly, barking urgently as he paced in circles. Paul looked up, his heart racing. He felt a strange chill in the air, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed from the entrance to the cave. Paul's body tensed, every instinct telling him that he wasn't alone. The soft glow of lantern light flickered against the stone walls as the figure emerged from the shadows.